San Mateo State's annual rose pruning seminar. It will last approximately 60 to 90 minutes and be recorded. A few days after the presentation, you'll be emailed a link to the recording and to an evaluation form to provide feedback. Questions can be asked at any time. For those viewing on Zoom, submit your questions by clicking on the chat box icon. Before we start, a little information about what's happening at the San Mateo Arboretum Society. Our nursery in Central Park is open Saturdays and Sundays, weather permitting, from noon till 3. It's closed today, right, Pat?
Yes.
Okay, not today.
No, it's open today.
Oh, it's open today?
It's open.
Okay,
It is? Yes.
okay.
After Sunday.
Nursery is open today. Enter the north gate. Payment is by credit or debit card and Apple or Google Pay. No cash is accepted. While you are in Central Park, visit the Rose Garden, Butterfly Hummingbird Garden, and our Sun and Shade demonstration gardens. All are maintained by Arboretum Society's volunteers. We're pleased to have Arboretum Society member, Rose Garden volunteer, and Rose expert, Archana, for today's program. Welcome, Archana.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everybody. To those in the room, thank you for braving the weather and joining me today. We lucked out. We have a lull today. And for those of you on Zoom, thank you for making the time. My name is Archana Singh, and as Susan said, I'm a San Mateo Arboretum Society volunteer and a member of the volunteer team taking care of the Central Park Rose Garden. I've been growing roses for over 25 years. I want to share a little bit of my rose journey with you because I think that'll help you understand what my rose philosophy is to care and maintenance and the pruning of roses. So over 25 years ago, I came to the US and I was in a small apartment and I found I was really missing plants around me. I've been so used to having, plants in the house. So I went out and I bought 4 potted roses. They just happened to be roses. I wasn't really thinking about roses. They just happened to be roses. I put them on my balcony and every waking moment I was there with them, cultivating the soil with a fork, taking a look at the leaves. If it turned slightly yellow one leaf there, I was snipping it off, reading books about roses. And then the best thing happened for the roses. I got a job. And I wasn't smothering those roses anymore because I think they would have otherwise died of love. All right, so that started me on the next phase. So I read more about roses. I kept my distance with them. They did beautifully. I got more roses and I was taking care of them by the book. So if it said prune to 2 feet, there I was with the ruler, 2 feet and pruning. All right, life happened. My daughter was born, I got a dog, work became really busy, and I found I just couldn't take care of those roses anymore the way that I did. First thing, I was sharing the garden with the roses, my daughter, my dog. I could not spray anymore. I didn't want to spray. That was a big change for me, a very different mindset. I started buying roses that were disease resistant. The roses did just fine. Less care, they were okay. I wasn't pruning the way I used to prune before. Sometimes I would prune as late as March. Sometimes I got this bright idea one year that I would use the Thanksgiving weekend to prune. So there I was out as early as late November. What happened? The roses were just fine. They bloomed just as beautifully. There were years where I could not get to pruning. What do you think happened? The roses were just fine, right? So that's where I have been for the last, I would say, 15 years. a very practical approach. I have roses in my garden. I do not have a rose garden. Roses are no different from other plants. They do require maintenance, but you don't have to mollycoddle them. I share this because there may be many of you who are new to growing roses, and I want to kind of, simplify things, demystify things about roses. There are many of you who might be experienced rose gardeners, and maybe this is a refresher or maybe a slightly different slant of how to look at rose pruning. And for those of you in between in the rose journey, maybe this gives you a slightly different perspective on things. So with that, let me just ask, maybe starting with those of you on Zoom, tell me a little bit about your rose growing experience. Do you consider yourself, beginners, experienced? And we'll do in the room maybe a show of hands. How many of you are, beginners, new to roses?
Same.
So we
Same.
Ask the.
I can't hear.
Yes, please use the chat to let me know. All right, experience, refresher, okay, great. All right, Laurie, great. Complete beginner, Teresa, all right. How about in the room? How many beginners, how many experienced rose gardeners? Is that the rest of you? Okay, all right, wonderful. All right, so I've promised you a practical, no nonsense approach to pruning. So let's get started. We have a handout. So those of you in the room should have found one on your seats. For those of you on Zoom, you should have a PDF that accompanied the Zoom link. So if you don't mind taking a moment and pulling the PDF up. So when we think about rose pruning, before we jump into things like the how-to, let's take a step back and ask ourselves the question, why do we prune roses? In old cemeteries all across California, there are roses that were planted 100, 150 years ago, and they were once loved, well tended at one point, but for many, many, many years now, decades, they haven't been cared for at all. And those roses bloom beautifully. No pruning. The only water they get is what rains we get in winter, and they bloom. So what does that tell us? We prune roses because we want to control their size. We grow them in our rose gardens, and we want roses to fit the space, right? We want to direct growth. For example, in our rose garden here in Central Park, we can't have roses encroaching on the pathways. We want to fit as many roses in the space. So we prune for size and we prune to control growth. Otherwise, roses really don't need to be pruned. If we don't prune them, they grow to the size of minivans and even more. We want to control the size, right? So that's the first thing I want you to remember, that roses don't need to be pruned. We prune roses for our purposes. Okay. The second thing, we are very lucky to live in a climate like the Bay Area, where growing roses just really grow on their own here. And you really cannot make an error when you prune, at least an error that is, damaging to the rose plant. So go with that assurance. You very rarely can make mistakes when pruning roses. All right, so why are we here? Because we can prune any which way, but we do want to maximize the outcome of pruning. Right, so let's take a look. The first sheet of the handout is rose classifications and types of modern roses. And we want to take a moment here to think about the different types of roses, because how we prune roses depends on what type of roses they are. So roses are broadly classified as old world roses or antique roses. The gallicas, the centifolias, those beautiful, fragrant once bloomers. Then the species roses and modern roses. And we'll focus on the modern roses. The antique old world roses, the once bloomers, are pruned very differently. They are not pruned in winter. You prune them after the flowering. And we're not going to focus there. My experience usually has been for people who grow once blooming roses, they already know. But if any of you do, and you do have any questions, just let me know and we'll cover that. The species roses, if you've got species roses growing, you're going to need armor, body armor to prune them. So we'll leave that out. Modern roses, that's what we're focusing on. So floribundas, hybrid teas, grandifloras, shrub roses, the David Austins, the English roses fall under the shrub rose category. So how do we approach pruning these types of common roses? The usual rule of thumb, hybrid teas, grandifloras actually respond very well to pruning. They like being cut down. They respond very, they're invigorated and they respond with new growth. So you can't go wrong. I would say about 2 feet down. So leave 2 feet of growth from the base. You should be good. Floribundas are beautiful bush-shaped roses. The hybrid teas, grandifloras are more rigid, upright. The floribundas generally more bush-shaped. You can also prune 1/3, 2/3 down, prune lightly, prune heavily, they'll take it. The shrub roses, and I'm going to distinguish to the shrub roses versus the landscape roses. Landscape roses are like the knockout. If you've seen the growth, very twiggy, lots of sharp, small thorns, and if you try and do the normal pruning carefully, no, take hedge clippers, cut them off, they will be fine. Don't prune them, they will be fine. The shrub roses and David Austins, a mixed bag. And here's where I'll come to my, advice that I like to give people. Observe how the roses grow. They each grow differently. Some David Austins, some shrub roses like to be cut back. Others sulk if you do. So again, if you do cut back a rose that sulks, you will know, and next year don't prune it. If you haven't pruned a rose and you think it's just become, what we call jolly green giant, prune it the next year. No harm done. All right. So the next page is rose care through the year. We included this because I think it's good to know, generally what you should be focusing on in rose maintenance and care through the years. But let's take a look at winter. So decreased watering. We wrote this in the drought years. This year, thankfully, we've got some good rains. So probably won't be decreasing watering. You should have turned off your watering system or, not out there with any watering can. This is the time, this is the period we prune roses. This is the winter pruning, the deep pruning, or not. This is the time you also want to be planting bare root roses. The bare root roses come in at this time. They are dormant. This is the best time, cool weather with the rains, get them out, planted, and then they should break dormancy and grow. And then also the last bullet written in the drought years, keep newly planted roses well watered. Whether it's through the rains or you have to supplement, the planted bare root roses need moisture. So that's just something to remember. And then depending on if we have time, we'll come back to the items for the rest of the year. We can cover them or if you have questions. And regarding questions, please feel free to ask as I'm going along. If you have I, some point you want further clarification, do stop me. Same thing to those of you on Zoom. Please do let me know via chat if you have any questions. There is a hand in the room. Yes.
If you say having bare root roses, it doesn't matter whether you do it in the pot or in the ground.
That is correct. So the
Repeat the
question,
question.
yeah, so for those of you on Zoom, the question was, if you have bare root roses, is there any difference if you are putting them in the ground or in a pot? And the answer to that is really no. You want to, it's the same principle, you want to keep that bare root rose well watered, moist but not soggy. And whether it's in a pot or in the ground, it's the same thing. The only thing that I would say, not this year, but most years when we haven't got our sufficient winter rains in the ground, you do want to be making sure that the ground is actually saturated, but moist, and not like you're watering a little bit, but it's not really reaching the roots. So that's the only point that I'd like to make. All right, so the next sheet, the fundamentals of pruning. So there's a lot of information here, and this is meant to be a reference for later, but I would like to go over a lot of the key points being made here. So pruning, what do you prune with? Pruning shears, right? Pruners. You want to get the bypass pruners, not the anvil. So the bypass are like the scissors. The anvil, one blade doesn't move and the other comes down, and that usually crushes the cane stem and doesn't make a clean cut. So you want to get the bypass pruners. Felco, that's the gold standard of rose growers, and they're a little bit more expensive, but extremely well made. They come in like different sizes. I use Fiskars. I've been using Fiskars for the last 25 years. They've worked for me. I've got smaller hands and I find they fit me really nicely. All right, we'll talk about cuts a little bit later, but as noted here, the proper cut is 45-degree angle, and you want to slant away from the bud eye. So you want to get as close as possible, but not too close, and you want to slant away. Who is going to take out their protractor and measure a 45-degree angle? None of us, right? All right, so 45 degrees is best. If it's a little more, a little less, flat, doesn't matter. All right, and then as part of pruning, we remove old dying canes. When you do that, you want to cut right to the base of the rose. Don't like cut halfway or anything like that. It's just aesthetically not pleasing, and also that can harbor disease and bring it down to the base of the rose. All right, I actually like the diagrams depicted where it says ready for pruning, dormant bush. That's exactly what a rose bush looks like. If you were to prune, cut away all the leaves, which I actually like to do, that is probably my labor of love. I have 75 roses and I do try to get most of the leaves cut out. That gives me an idea what the rose actually looks like. It helps remove disease. And, in our winter months, so our roses don't go dormant here. And in the winter months, we do get a little bit of, late season disease. When I remove the leaves, it just looks nice. So small rose garden, small garden, just nice to have something all clear. But yeah, so once you have an idea what the shape of your rose bush looks like, you'll see that there are main canes and then side, stems. And the general rule of thumb to pruning, 3 Ds: remove diseased, damaged, and dead wood. So that's the no-brainer. You don't even think twice. You remove diseased, damaged, and dead wood. After that, yeah, thank you. Do you cut the leaves or do you pinch and pull them off the stem? I do either. If I've got my pruner with me, I will, just cut. Sometimes it depends on the rose too. Sometimes the leaves are just like you give a tug and they drop off. So Jim, both work equally well, whatever, is the easiest. Okay, so yes, so you want to get rid of disease, damaged, and dead wood. Then you want to take a look, and now this is where you want to look at the rose bush. You want to prune for size. You want to prune for shape. You want to prune for growth direction. I like to, especially if the rose is new and young, I take a very light approach to pruning. I might just prune like a few inches and leave the plant. If the rose is not vigorous, I don't prune too much either. But the general rule for your hybrid teas, grandifloras, bring them down to about 2 feet. For your floribundas, prune to shape, they can take, down to a foot, 18 inches, 2 feet as well.
Yeah, they're online.
Right, roses are still blooming and making new leaves. Exactly, Bavaria, many places, we don't go dormant, right? And so it's hard for me. I have roses still blooming too. I will take the blossoms, bring them inside, and then strip the leaves. Some people say that the roses go dormant when you strip the leaves. I haven't really found that, but Penelope just, I would really, this is where you can prune as early as November, as late as March, prune down for size if you need to. And if you don't need to prune, if you feel the size of the rose is okay, don't prune. I'd love to hear in summer what your comments will be, and I think it'll be the roses just bloomed fine. Okay. All right. Right. And then you start, I mentioned you remove damaged wood. If there's old, unproductive canes, you want to get rid of those as well. Remember to cut right to the base. And then there's something about mild climates and, where there's winter damage. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about winter damage. All right, and I'm going to skip the standard for right now. We'll come back to it when we talk a little bit about grafted roses. All right, pruning climbers. So pruning climbers, it's a little bit different because, so again, here, the general rule is if it's a newly planted climber, don't prune for a couple of years. Start maybe in the 3rd year. What you want to be doing with young climbers is at this time, looking at training them. So if you've got them, up an arbor or espalier on a fence, for example, right? Like this is the time to tie them, retie them, kind of take a look and see where you want them to go. When you tie up the climbing roses, a couple of things. First, make sure that whatever structure you're tying your climbing roses to, those are sturdy. Roses, climbing roses, they just act like a sail, and in the wind, they will bring down what you think is even the strongest arbor. So make sure those things are really firmly in the ground. The climbing roses, the canes can be either very stiff. Those roses do very nicely espalier on the fence, for example, or the rose canes are very lax and they make very nice pillar roses. My one big tip here, do not weave rose canes through a lattice, for example. you will regret it when it comes time to removing that cane. So just tie on one side of the lattice, don't weave them through. So climbing roses have main canes, big arching canes, and then they have side laterals. And what you want to do is, again, if you're controlling for size, you can cut the main canes down, and then the laterals you want to bring down to anywhere from 6, 10, 12 inches, at least 2 bud eyes. So I have a climbing rose here. It's still a baby. So this is Sally Holmes, gorgeous single pale white pink rose. We have Sally Holmes on the arbor here in the pump house. So do take a look on your way out if you haven't seen her yet. She's spectacular and in full bloom. So let's see if I can get this for those of you on Zoom. But here is the arching cane. You want to arch canes as much as you can horizontally, because that causes the bud eyes along the length of the cane to grow. Those become laterals, and those are the flowering shoots. So on your sheet, they're referred to, the laterals are referred to as flowering shoots. And here, the laterals aren't very big, but you can see here, this is a lateral, this is a lateral, and I'd actually pruned this earlier, I think might have been, early December. So otherwise, these laterals were actually quite long. But I did want to show you, just the arching cane of a climbing rose. And once this gets into the ground, it's just going to break loose. And we'll come back and we do a little bit of the demonstrations. All right. So with that, I think we are ready for, no, not yet. Sorry. All right, making the cut. I love this picture. I think it just shows exactly like how you can prune stems and where the mistakes are. Again, don't get too nervous about this. As you prune roses, if you get most of the cuts right, your rose is going to be right. Okay, so making the cut. The first stem on the left, incorrect, crushed with dull pruners. So you see on top, right, that's just somewhere like disease can get into the rose. You want to make as clean a cut as possible. So good pruners, bypass should do the trick. The second from the left, incorrect, cut too far from the bud. So you see the bud eye a good 1.5 inches below. So what's going to happen there? The rose is going to push nutrients up to that bud and not beyond. So that portion, 1.5 inches above the bud, is slowly going to die away, die back, right? And a lot of times that dieback doesn't stop at the bud, it can go lower. And suddenly you've got to prune a cane much further down than you had wanted to, okay? Then the third, incorrect, the angle is very steep and it goes below that bud, right? So what happens here? The rose is going to push nutrients, but it may not get to, the nutrients may not get to that bud, and most likely you're going to get a very weak bud or an aborted bud. And so again, you're going to have to prune further down. And then the next is incorrect because the angle is towards the bud. The slant is down towards the bud. What does that do? Rain, it's going to come down. Water is going to drip off onto the bud. And, chances are the bud would abort, or it's not going to be as, healthy as it could be otherwise be. And the last is the correct one, where the cut is just above the bud. It slants away from that bud, and that's what you want to kind of strive for. All right, so let's now see. All right, so I have here with me some of the things that I always have when I am pruning my roses. So first thing, pruners. So as I mentioned before, Felcos, Fiskars, Corona, anything that is a bypass. So maybe this way, you can see the blades past each other. Okay. I like to have a pruning saw. So when you're cutting those diseased or damaged canes right down, or unproductive canes right down to the base of the plant, these are very nice, lets you get in, right, without hurting yourself, and you can prune or cut the cane right to the base, the crown of the rose. So this is very helpful. And then I like my loppers for those big canes, right? So these are some of the things I like to use. Pruners, that's probably for me, just, at minimum, you should have a good pair of pruners. Protective gear, glasses. I wear glasses. 1 year, I was cutting a large shrub. The canes just whipped across. I had a slash from my ear to my eye. My ear got caught, but my eye was protected because of my glasses. So I would highly recommend wearing glasses. And then gloves. So I like these long gauntlets, kind of protects all the way up to my elbows, allows me to grip canes a little bit more easily. And I will kind of move between gloves that are thinner on my hand and I can actually feel what I'm doing versus these large ones where I can grip. I will say, so something that I don't have here because I've actually run out, so it is a good reminder for me to get. You want to keep a little bottle of iodine. So iodine solution or iodine spray or swabs, easily available in any pharmacy. They are the best antimicrobial when you get jabbed by a thorn. It happens, right? And there are people, unfortunately, my rose community, who have had infections set in when they've got jabbed with thorn. So don't take it lightly. Keep that iodine nearby, and definitely swab if you get jabbed. All right, and then I like to keep a disinfectant. This is like Lysol wipes or Clorox wipes, and I will wipe my pruners in between roses, especially if there's a rose, a lot of disease on it, just late season. Like to just wipe them out and air dry them a little bit. I found actually roses don't like Lysol on them, so just air dry them out, and you are then ready to prune. Oh, and while I get my gloves on, the other thing that I want to say, nice to wear a jacket, like a thick jacket. It's anyway winter, so wear your jacket when you're out there. It helps to protect. The other thing, wear thick-soled shoes. Ask me how I know, and I'm saying that. Very, very painful. All right, had to abort that day's rose pruning. All right, Kevin, if you can use the camera that shows us the rose. And yes, the question.
Do you put cinnamon or anything on the
cut?
open? On the cut?
Yeah. So the question was, do I use cinnamon or any other, antifungal, antibacterial on the cut when I make it? The answer is no. A lot of cuts, a lot of roses. If you feel that you need to, right? Like you want to protect from disease coming in, you can. Cinnamon is kind of, yeah, heard about cinnamon. People also used to use Elmer's glue to seal the cuts. I have done that on occasion. I forget for why I did it, but it worked. So, all right. So let's see here. The 3Ds, that's the first thing, right? So diseased, damaged, dead. So damaged, wind brought this down, right? So what do you want to do? You want to go to the closest bud, and that is over here. And I'm going to come around. I respect roses with thorns. So, so here, let's do this. Let's do what I would normally do if this was, I was doing this at home. I would be cutting off first. Time cutting, but I would be cutting off leaves to see what the bush looks like, right? And then the bud is here. It's outward facing. This is outward facing. So I would prune here and slant away. So sorry, I think I'm gonna be, maybe if you look at the camera for those of you in the room, and that's it. Okay. And I would get that. All right, so damaged. There isn't much diseased here. This is a rose that someone donated to us. There isn't much disease here. I think we cleaned that up when we got the rose earlier last year. All right. You also want to do stems that are thin, are moving into the rose, open it up. That helps with air circulation. I didn't believe in that much, but I do have a rose that is very twiggy, lots of inwardly growing canes. And I was getting some, after the first flush, a lot of spots on the leaves. And I started opening it up to improve air circulation. I've been doing that for the last couple of years, and it has helped. So I've become a believer. So leaves, keep working on the leaves. Here is what was a flowering stem. There's a hip forming. I want to bring this down. There's from the base here, there's one bud point, there's a second one, and I would go, there's a thorn there as well. Okay, by this thing, I've got to go. Okay. I like to have a bucket or something to collect the rose trimmings. It's always helpful. It's hard gathering afterwards. So, all right. And then inwardly facing, for me, this is a no-brainer. This one goes, and you will notice what I did. I got it right at the junction. Don't leave, significant portion. It's just not required. And then it's about, again, going in and finding things that are growing inwardly. This one, nice, it had flowered, but it's inward facing. I don't know if this is easily visible, but on this cane, there's a tiny 1-inch shoot. That's probably a blind shoot. Never going to do anything, probably not. I'm going to cut that off as well. Pass it around here. To the blind shoot? Yeah. Oh. Right. So I also like to, so when I'm pruning a rose, remember we prune for size. We also prune for shape. And what I like to do is I like to keep like the center a little taller and then away from the center, prune them lower. So the rose gets like a kind of dome shape and you actually have flowers like, you can see the flowers better because it's just covered. So if I were, maybe I've got this in a pot and it's against, a wall or a fence, I might keep this taller and in the front a little bit lower. So here's another inwardly growing. So that gets pruned right to the base. And then this is about this height. There's something here. I would probably prune this. So when there are multiple stems, I like to kind of prune them at the same level. And the reason for that is, so when the rose is pushing nutrients, it's pushing nutrients to the same level versus one up and one down. So here, there's something going out that way, in there. And you can see I'm not going too further, like too down. I'm just like keeping it a little bit on the higher side. All right, and then I want to keep this at the same level. There is, so here, this is where a cut was made previously. And then the rose had a bud and then grew this length, probably ended in flowers. I can do a couple of things. I can make a cut. I can leave this new growth and make a cut here. Or I can bring it down further. Up to me here. I like this going out this way. I'm going to make the cut here. And in which case I might bring this one down. And this is an inward growing bud, unfortunately. So I'm on this one, I'm going to err. There's an outward here, and I'm going to cut over here. Kind of got it a little bit. Outward bud here. Okay. And right, so that's pretty much what I would be doing. Outward here, I am going to cut here. As I mentioned, I like to have a little bit taller back, a little bit smaller in front. Removing leaves, and let's take a look at this guy. So here again, something inward, but I am actually going to leave that because there's a possibility that this actually grows up in the center, and it may grow straight. It may not actually grow into other canes. So I'm just going to bring it down a bit. The one thing I would say, observe your roses. They actually do talk. They will tell you how they want to be pruned, how much they want to be pruned. So if you've got a new rose, I think I mentioned this before, maybe don't get, too prune happy. Just do some light pruning and see how the rose is growing. And then next year, prune it down like the way, wants to be pruned. Inward growing cane, I am actually going to take this one off. And okay. Now, you'll see leaves looking like this. We'll talk a little bit about disease a little later. Late season disease on leaves, they shouldn't be important. Like, these are old leaves, they will get disease. Just cut them off and don't worry about them. diseased leaves in summertime, after the first flush, that's a little bit more like you think about it a little bit. Late season disease on leaves, you can just apply. All right.
Putting those leaves in your compost.
Oh, yeah. So the question, what about putting the leaves diseased leaves in compost? Oh, boy. So one camp that believes you should be getting rid of diseased leaves and putting them into the trash, tying them up in a trash bag really tightly. And then another camp that believes, well, once the leaves are off the bush, those spores, usually fungal, actually die. So those people will compost those rose leaves. I prefer not to compost. I will throw the leaves. Actually, let me take that back. When I say I prefer not to compost, I mean, I do not put them into my home compost. I will put them into the city's compost because the city's compost, they go through a much more rigorous decomposition process. The temperatures that that decomposition process gets to is a lot more than what I can achieve at home. So I don't put them in my home compost. I will put them in the compost bin. All right. So yeah, and it's just a question of going around. There's this little twiggy thing that goes off. And this is a good time. I don't know if you can see on Zoom, people in the room, there's this big, thick cane. And if you see, there aren't any other canes like that. This is an old rose. Maybe this is a good time, Kevin. Yes, thank you. You are focusing at the bottom. Take a look at the base of this rose. I hope you can see, but essentially the base of this rose, the bud union, spans from here, show it with my gloved hand, which you can see the contrast, from here all the way till here. This is an old rose. It's had many big canes, which have been cut off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 that I can see. So for this rose, it's about trying to rejuvenate it. We wanted to use it as a demonstration for pruning, but if this were my rose, it really is about rejuvenating this rose. It had a good life. It probably has a few more years, but yeah, it's an old rose. All right, so it's entirely possible that the graft is still very much alive and that it sends out, some more canes, or we're pretty much on the last set of canes. So we will know in a couple of years. All right. What I wanted to talk about a little bit is what I had come to here. So roses are grafted. So the desired rose is actually budded onto another rose where the rose has a very vigorous root system, but the rose itself isn't desirable. And so most of the roses, or I shouldn't say most, a lot of the roses that you can, you see in stores like Home Depots, Lowe's, some garden centers, those are grafted roses. It's the easiest way for rose companies to get roses, out for sale. The graft is field grown, and then to ship this. So this is a rose that we just picked up from Home Depot last week. It is a bare root rose that has been potted. So this is the graft. This portion is the graft. This is the original rose, the undesired rose. It was grown in the field and then it was cut off here. And the desired rose, which is all of this, was budded at several points to this rose. And those shoots are now coming out. So the rose that we want to, the stems that we want to have grow are these stems. Anything that comes from below this, actually, maybe this is a better way to look at it. Anything that would come from below is undesired. Because it belongs to this rose, not this rose. You can have what we call suckers, right? So suckers either coming from this cane here or from the roots. And you want to cut those suckers off as you're pruning. That's the other thing. It's really good when you're doing winter pruning to take a look at any suckers and remove those. Suckers, it's the undesired plant. It takes away nutrients from the desired part of the rose. Yes.
How low do you go with the suckers? I mean, sometimes they're under the ground. How deep do you need to go?
Right. So the question in the room was, how deep do you need to go to remove those suckers? So suckers, two types. One from the cane itself. Those are easy because you just cut right at the base. The ones from the root, oh my gosh, I feel your question. Those are so much harder. And you do, so this is the catch-22. When you have a grafted rose, you do not want to do much cultivation of the soil around it, because if you break those roots, that's what triggers the suckers to come up. Now, when you want to get to removing those suckers, you do have to get down to where the root is and pull them out from the root. You do not want to cut off suckers. Why? Because that's pruning. That is giving the signal, oh, grow some more, right? So it's hard. You want to go in as best as you can without really disturbing the soil. I like to tug. Susan knows this. Tug. And then last resort is getting in and digging. Yeah. So great question on that.
Got another online.
Oh, question online. What causes a rose to revert back to the original undesirable part? It usually goes back to a smallish reddish purplish flower. Correct. So Lori, absolutely right. So the red purplish flower, that is actually the rootstock. Most common rootstock is Dr. Huey, and that's a red purple flower. So if you have had a rose that was a beautiful pink rose, and next year it was this deep red, well, it's reverted to rootstock. The undesirable part of the rose you bought it for, that has died back. So to answer your question, Lori, what causes a rose to revert back to the original? Lot of things. Badly budded roses. This isn't a great example of a budded rose. It's all budded on one side. Usually there should have been, some more on this side. If anything were to happen to this section, well, you've just lost all the desired rose stems. Roses are graded. So you want to go to like grade A roses where they're budded a lot better. Sometimes a graft just doesn't take, Lori. And so, after some time, the desired rose just dies away and there aren't any more bud eyes for that rose to come back. Also with age, this rose, for example, after some time, there is no more place on that graft, no more bud eyes for that desired rose to grow. And so over time, you find that a rose will revert to the rootstock. And sometimes, like I said, it's just Dr. Huey is so vigorous. You cultivate the soil and he just starts putting up, suckers, and all the nutrients go to the suckers and that graft just dies. And I lost a rose a couple of years ago to that. I had moved the rose. It did well for a couple of years, and then I just got suckers all over the place, like 5 feet away and things like that. And the rose just started dwindling. And yeah. All right. So we looked at grafted roses, budded roses. You have own root roses. So own root roses are roses that you pretty much grow from a cutting of the desired rose. So there is no secondary root stock. The roots are the roots of the actual rose. And so this Sally Holmes is grown from a cutting, and its roses are its own, its roots are its own roses. So when you're pruning, it's also good to know, right, whether your rose is grafted or whether it's own root. An own root rose can sucker, but it will be that rose, that desired rose, right? So you can be judicious. If it's suckering 5 feet away, you might want to take it away. But if it's suckering close by, you do not want to cut that off. That's the rose growing. Okay. So we covered grafted roses or budded roses. We covered own root roses. And then at this time of the year, I mentioned that you get roses in bare root form. So bare root roses can be either own root or grafted. What happens is they're grown in the fields, and then shortly before our winter months, the roses are dug up, washed of all dirt, cut back, pretty much cut back to, few inches, 6 inches or so. The roots are cut back, and then they are put into cold storage. People have started waxing them, so it's going to be hard to tell, but these stems have been coated in wax, and that's to preserve the moisture of the stems. And yeah, and then they're sold at this time of the year. If you're getting bare root roses, something I mentioned before, you want to put them into the ground, you want to keep them moist. What I like to do is I like to soak the bare root roses first in a bucket of water, anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. So, the roses had a chance to take in some moisture and then plant. So,
I have a question.
yes, there's a question in the room. Yes.
Is it easy to identify a rose that is grown with the root stock versus it's growing solely by
On
itself?
its own.
I mean, is it easy to just look at the union?
Yeah.
Easy to identify the union?
Yeah, so the question in the room was, is it easy to identify a rose that is a grafted rose from a rose that is own root? And for the most part, yes. The grafted rose will have that union, the graft, like a bulb, right? It's a knob that you see. In California, we tend to grow the roses with that knob, that graft, above few inches above the ground. In colder climates, they will actually bury the graft to just below the soil line. So if you see something like this, a shank and then a bulb with stems coming out, that is usually grafted. I say usually because I have seen own roots based on how the shoot was rooted that looks like the ground. So it's not always easy, but the graft, the more you look at it, the structure of it, you can kind of make out that it's been grafted. Yes.
Yeah, this and that.
Yes, and that, thank you, Susan. So that brings, take a look at the next sheet, suckers versus basal roots. That has a really good, depiction of what a grafted rose looks like. So you have the bud union, that's that knob that you see. You usually, in California, you will see a shank, like above the soil line, a stem. And then I think you had asked the question, right? Like suckers, where do they come from? They can come from that shank or from below the root. And so that this diagram I really like because it shows you A, sucker from the roots, and B, sucker from the rootstock that is just below that graft. And if there's any doubt about a sucker, I think just wait. Dr. Huey is a once blooming rose and will bloom on a cane that has not been cut back. So if you cut it, it's unlikely to bloom because once bloomers bloom on old wood, not new wood. And so if you have a cane that's coming from the bottom and it just hasn't flowered, guess what? It's likely to be a sucker. Okay. A Zoom question? Okay. Can you give any advice about transplanting fairly mature roses? Yes, indeed, Penelope. So we've got a last sheet in the handout about planting roses, but let me talk about transplanting mature roses. And unfortunately, we don't always have the luxury of doing those transplant of mature roses at the right time of the year. Ideal would be fall into early spring. So you want to dig as wide as you possibly can. If you're doing it in summer months, you want to keep as much of the soil as possible. I would say bring the canes down. Leave at least 3 feet of cane, and then dig your new hole, cover the plant, put the plant in, cover the plant with some, a chair or, some tarp. You don't want to cook the rose. I've done that, unfortunately. I covered it with something and the rose started cooking underneath. Thankfully, I realized and, I took the covering off and aired it. You just want to protect from sun and water the heck out of it. That's, Penelope, what I would say for if you are moving a mature rose during summer months. If you're moving in fall, winter, early spring, you have another option. You can actually bare root that rose. So pull it out of the ground, remove all of the soil, cut back the canes, and then plant that rose. I like doing that, and I've done it several times because that gives me an excellent opportunity to get rid of weeds and, oxalis and grass, just bare root the whole thing and plant it. So Lori, I hope that answers your question. Okay, and then there's one more. Susan asked, thank you. What causes standard white roses to become pink roses when they've never been pink before? Yeah, so that's probably another case of the desired white rose becoming like dying out and the rootstock showing up. Another rootstock, and actually quite popular in California in the early days, 50, 70 years ago, is a rose called Manetti, which is pink. So Susan, that might be the case. They're also doing fancy things now where they will graft 2 types of roses. So have you seen those trees like, the War and Peace, white roses on one side, red roses on the other side? Yeah. So Susan, it's very likely possible that, the pink is the rootstock, especially if they are small pink flowers. And then Lori asked, do prune roses need to be sprayed with dormant spray? Assuming there's no rain, should it be done as close to pruning as possible? Do roses need to be dormant sprayed? My answer will be no, they don't need to be. We'll talk a little bit about disease management. We've got a section on that. But yes, assuming there's no rain, you do want to do it as close to pruning as possible, because what you've done with pruning and cutting off the leaves is trying to force that rose into dormancy. So that's when you would put the dormant spray. Yes, one question in the room.
I'm reading here on the sheet that was recently displayed
Mhm.
about basil shoot, and I wasn't really familiar with that. So a basil shoot does not become a cane. Is that correct?
Basil shoot is it's the term for the new canes of the desired rose. So basil canes, basil shoots are a good thing.
So basil shoot becomes a cane.
Yes. Yes.
Archana,
Yes.
we've had in the rose garden, last year, we had a volunteer that did some really heavy pruning on a rose that had a lot of old canes,
Mhm.
and maybe took out, I mean, maybe it had 6 old canes, took out 3 or so of them, and really had a lot of new basil shoots
Yeah, that came out.
coming out.
So Susan reminded me that we had an old rose we have an old rose in the Central Park Rose Garden, and one of the volunteers actually took out a lot of the old unproductive canes, and there were a lot. And if you see the size of that graph, it's huge. 1.5 feet easily. Never seen anything like it. And that rose responded by sending up so many new basil shoots. We got like beautiful green, healthy growth. So that's, as I mentioned, why do we prune, right? The other is it helps to invigorate the rose. And for old roses, it can be a 50-50. You can lose the rose because the graft has nothing more to give. Or as in our case, we actually got, that taking away of all the old productive canes triggered the rose to send up new basil shoots. All right, so let's take a look at a little bit. Actually, Lori, we actually come now to the disease portion. All right, so yeah, roses, like many other plants, will get diseases. Diseases and pests. So disease-wise, I list here the more common ones, common to the Bay Area. They are mostly fungal in nature. So rust, powdery mildew, and black spot. So rust, you'll see these orange dots on the underside of leaves. Again, if it's late season, I wouldn't worry about it. If it's happening throughout the year, then a couple of options, right? So I mentioned earlier that I am completely no spray, which means I do not, treat those roses with anything. There are disease-resistant varieties, so rust-resistant roses, so that's an option. If you do want to spray for these fungal diseases, then I would say read carefully the instructions on, whatever you are using to spray. Do it on a day where there's no wind. And yeah, and then take, all the necessary precautions. Yes, Susan, did you have?
We don't spray in the rose garden at all.
So,
It's all
Susan,
organic.
right. So for those of you on Zoom, Susan mentioned we do not spray anything on our roses in the rose garden. And if you've visited in person and seen, our roses flowering and all through the year, you can see that, not spraying doesn't hurt the roses. The disease, again, I bring it back to, we are very lucky in the Bay Area. The climate is very conducive to growing roses. And, you really, a lot of it can be aesthetic. So, you don't like looking at rose with diseased leaves. And so if you don't have a sentimental attachment to a rose that is disease prone, then I would say consider replacing it with a more disease resistant rose.
Pick leaves off.
Pick leaves off. Two things, and that really helps, especially if it's not so much the rose that is disease prone, but it's a year when you have just the right conditions for fungal infections to set in. So picking the leaves off, opening up like air circulation, that helps. The other, so things like powdery mildew, it's just, unfortunately, Bay Area are conditions, right? Like high daytime temperatures, low nighttime temperatures, low humidity during the day, high humidity in the night, powdery mildew. It's hard. Roses that are prone to powdery mildew will get it in the Bay Area. And over the 25 years that I've grown roses here, I've tried everything. Back in the day, some people spray diluted milk. I've just found nothing really works. And I've had roses, as in the picture. I mean, it looks like powdered sugar has been sprinkled all over them. There's no point. I tolerate some because we're in the Bay Area. You can't find roses that don't get powdery mildew. Rust, I'm less tolerant. I find that if a rose is prone to rust, it never loses that. And rust does spread through the garden. So I think I've removed one rose because of rust. Black spot, not too much of a problem for us, thankfully. I really sympathize with growers in other parts of the country who have to deal with black spot. Picking leaves off, as Susan mentioned, actually, I think helps a lot with black spot. Yes.
Where to keep your watering just the base instead of having it spray, seems to help with the disease too.
The fungal diseases. So comment from the room was about watering practice. So if you're watering the base of the rose and not the leaves, then that helps to control fungal disease. And yes, in general, that is true. For powdery mildew, they do suggest watering the rose, spraying the rose leaves early in the morning, letting them dry. The thing is, I have so much of dew in my garden. And I think, well, I took all that trouble not to spray water on the leaves, and then the dew falls, and right? I'm like 4 a.m. in the morning. I remember once, I'm like, the leaves are all wet. It's right. So yeah, again, right? Just in general, I think you're absolutely right. Water at the base of the rose, not the leaves. I like to use drip irrigation, and I've especially with the drought years, I found that that's really helped. Downy mildew, I added that in because it is a problem in especially our wet springs when we used to have them. So let's see how this year goes. It can bring a rose completely down, kill a rose. Usually downy mildew, affects the rose, the weather changes, and the rose recovers. But I've lost a rose to downy mildew before. Okay, then disease. So we covered diseases, pests, aphids. Probably everybody who's grown roses has been familiar with aphids. You see this very unsightly, tiny bugs on top of those beautiful buds that you've been anticipating. You know, I've found even in the worst years of infestation, they haven't really damaged the buds. And I like to go, you know, I'm not as squeamish, so I just like to go and, you know, with my fingers, I will squish the aphids. Wear gloves. If you can't, you can use a spray of water. I'll come back to, right, water. But a spray of water on the buds will, you know, disperse the aphids, and, you know, they do come back. I don't think they crawl back. I think they're just blown in by the winds, a new set. Something I just want to share, because in the last several years, I've been gardening a lot for the birds and the bees. And I found that if I'm not squishing the aphids, the birds are coming in and eating them. And it's just such a wonderful sight to see these little birds on these, you know, buds, just like the buds are just like, you know, falling over with the weight of the bird, and they're just pecking at it. The aphids are gone. I might see them for a day or two, and the third day, I do not have aphids in the garden. And here in the rose garden, we get aphids. We go around squishing, and I think it was only 1 year, Susan, where the infestation was so bad. We went around with some soap water and sprayed, and the aphids were gone. And I did that 1 year, and I found the birds didn't come in, so I stopped with the soap spray in my own garden.
Yeah, but
Zoom question. Just discovered borer pest in rose this, yeah. Okay, Ingrid, so for borers, yeah, you want to cut the cane back to where you see healthy, you know, full growth. So the borers, you'll see, like, you know, there's a hole in the cane. Keep cutting back until you see that healthy growth. You can use Elmer's glue. I think I'm recalling now, I mentioned I'd used Elmer's glue at one point. I think I'd found a borer, and I used Elmer's glue to seal all the cuts I had made. So that's something that you may want to try. And hopefully that it's not too bad, and you don't have too many canes that have borer damage, but do cut the cane back until you see healthy pith. Yeah. Yes.
I was under the impression that horticultural oil or neem oil was a relatively safe spray product to use as long as the bees were out at the time you were spraying. Is that true, or is that not true?
That is true. Neem oil is definitely safer than a lot of products out there. They can hurt the bees. So if you do use neem oil, and thank you for bringing this up. So the question was, you know, is neem oil safe? You won't find that on the label of, you know, neem oil products, which I think isn't correct, but studies have shown that neem oil can hurt bees. And so you definitely want to spray either really early in the morning or late in the evening when bees are not around. And then some of the dormant sprays, I had just been reading a study some years back where dormant sprays affect earthworms. So people were recommending like putting some tarp down when you use dormant sprays and horticultural oils. And then if you do spray, remember the adage, don't spray when temperatures are above, like I think 80 degrees, that can really damage the roses. Okay. Aphids, and then I wanted to show you, this rose actually had a few leaves where, I don't know if you can see, maybe I show it against me. Can you see the holes in the leaves? Does anyone know what causes this? The lace-like effect, holes in the leaves? So rose slugs, and you will find them on the underside of leaves, these tiny caterpillar-like things, you know, whitish gray in color. They're not caterpillars, so something like BT will not help. The birds will get them. They are underside. I've seen, like, evening, the rose is fine, come in the morning and you see these holes. 1 year I had, oh my God, so many of my roses with holes like this. And I got my daughter and 3 of her friends and told them 10 cents for every slug they squish. That was the best $40 I've ever spent. The kids loved it. They had a blast squishing those things. So $40 and ice cream afterwards, I thought was good. Yeah. So that's so aphids, rose slugs. There's leaf hoppers that, you know, they kind of stuck on the leaves, and you kind of see some stipules. Squish those as well. They're a little harder because they jump around. Yeah, that's pretty much what I see here in the rose garden as well as in my personal garden. So, right, so a little bit to recap, winter pruning, the 3 Ds. You want to get diseased, damaged, dead wood. Take a step back, take a look at your rose. If it's a young rose or if it isn't very vigorous, then you don't really need to do too much more. You could prune maybe like an inch, half an inch, just to get the rose, you know, growing triggered. For hybrid tea roses, grandifloras, the floribundas, prune for shape, prune to direct growth. You can go down to 2 feet. It's not going to harm the rose. Remember, again, we live in a very benign climate for rose growing. Own root versus grafted. So just kind of take a look. That's the time you want to remove any suckers, right? Take a look. Once you open up the structure of the rose, that's when you decide, like, you know, how you want your rose to grow. And I will say, I've said this before, we live in a climate, we're very lucky. I think growing roses, pruning, it's really easy. There's a wealth of information out there. I would say read, but I would caution. There are people sharing their wealth of knowledge from, you know, all different parts of the country, of the world. So some advice that pertains to, let's say, rose growers in the East Coast may not pertain to us. You know, so just as you're reading, apply, you know, some common sense. If something doesn't make sense to you, you know, question it. Rose growing is, you know, considered, well, roses are considered fussy and high maintenance. I challenge that. And I would encourage you to do the same and to really just take joy in rose growing. And yes, we'll do some questions. Yes.
One of the products as far as you're concerned, is the disease part of it not good? And what do you recommend for feeding roses?
Okay, so the question was on feeding roses, and the person here in the room uses a 3-in-1. So the 3-in-1, I think it is a fertilizer plus a systemic, and maybe I think something that acts immediate. They're fine. You can certainly use that. I personally don't, because I've moved away completely from chemicals. But they work. They're good products.
Do you use chicken manure or anything like that?
So do I use chicken manure? Yes, I do. So I live where we have very nutrient less soil, sandy soil. So I like to augment the soil with as much organic material as I can. So I will use chicken manure. So just very quickly, my fertilizer routine. I like to fertilize after the first big flush because roses have put a lot of energy into getting those beautiful blooms out. So giving them at that point a quick release fertilizer, which is basically anything that you can dissolve in water that reaches the roses the fastest. So I like to do that. I say like because I don't always get to it. Life happens. And in spring, I like to use the organics. So if it's chicken manure or, just I'm trying to think these rose tone. I don't use rose tone because if you go to the store, you see rose tone and you see holly tone, and rose tone is more expensive than holly tone. And I always like to say, roses don't read labels, right? They don't care. So I will pick up a bag of polytone and I'll put polytone down, and the roses seem to like it. So I will use anything that I find on sale. That's good. I like to see something that has micronutrients in it, not just the three main, micro and all right. Yes. Yeah, thank you. You're very welcome, Susan. All right. All right. Yes, some more questions?
Yeah. Do you use eggshells to add calcium to the or coffee grounds?
So the question was, do I use eggshells or coffee grounds? Eggshells, no, because we do have skunks and raccoons in the backyard. Plus, I have dogs, and they will dig if I put anything of blood meal, eggshells, coffee grounds. I have. I found coffee grounds. I didn't see much of a difference with roses, but my hydrangeas love coffee grounds, so I actually use coffee grounds on my hydrangeas.
I actually read a study where they found that coffee grounds do have a fair amount of nitrogen.
Yeah,
So it's good.
yeah. Coffee grounds, great stuff.
And as far as the rose garden, about March, we always get garden compost or diesel compost from Linkso. And the garden compost, they mix in rose and flower fertilizer. And so we will put about a ½ inch of that around our roses in the rose garden, and then cover with a good layer of mulch. And we use their arbor mulch, which is kind of a mix of different woods. And Terry Linkso says that's really very good for the soil.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And Susan has a few concluding remarks. So.
Thank you, Archana. That was excellent. And I always look at something new, and I really like your no nonsense approach. So in a few days, everyone will be emailed a link to recording of this presentation and also an evaluation form. And those of you in person here have an evaluation form. We appreciate if you fill it out. Let us know what works, what doesn't work, how we can improve, or what programs you'd like to see us have in the future. The pruning, annual pruning of the rose gardens originally scheduled for January 14th, Saturday. That's right now postponed to January 21st, because of the rain, we don't want to be in the rose garden, tromping around the roses, compacting the soil. I suspect that might be postponed to even the following Saturday. Right now, we have rain at least through the 16th. And so there's not going to be enough time for the ground to dry out. So you can register. I know some of you have registered for the pruning. I will be letting you know, keeping you updated, emailing you on what the status is. It'll also be on our website. So if you're interested in some more practice and actually getting hands-on, we'll have rose garden volunteers there to help everyone and register on our website, sanmatalearboretum.org. Did you have something, Pat?
No.
Okay.
How many rows do you have?
Sue, she wanted to know how many roses you have? We have.
Oh, about 175. So we really appreciate all the help that we can get. And then also in March, when we do the compost and the mulching, it's really nice to have some additional volunteers. So that'll also be on our website. So please join us for future seminars and workshops. The next seminar is going to be Sunday, February 12th, and it's going to be on home composting. So you can sign up for this in person or on Zoom on our website, again, sanmataoarboretum.org. Join the Arboretum Society and receive a discount on workshops at a variety of nurseries and businesses on the peninsula, and also get a 10% discount on our nursery. Also, let us know if you're interested in volunteering by signing up on our website, or you can email us at info@sanmataoarboretum.org. We have a variety of opportunities from working in the nursery or the rose garden, maintenance, and community outreach, and many more opportunities. A final note, we're starting a fundraising campaign for 2 custom rose arbors at the east and west entrances to the rose garden. So we are starting a fundraising campaign for that. It will be up on our website soon, so take a look. And these are really going to be beautiful custom structures and coordinated architecturally with the gazebo and with our entrance here to the pump house. So take a look for that. Thank you again, Archana. We really appreciate it. And Kevin, our Zoom technical specialist. Without whom these programs would not be happening. So that concludes our program. Thank you, everyone.